friends. Because NaNoWriMo is coming up, I just wanted to talk about how I write, and I'll talk more about my Nano project later in the month. But I wanted to tell you guys that I write stories in 6 stages, 5 drafts. I go from a 0 draft to a draft 5. They're not really all drafts. The first one is more of a process, and then by the time we end up at the 6th one, we have something that's ready to go on submission. So my 0 draft. This is what I call my discovery draft. It's more of a process than a draft. When I'm done with this, what I have is a lot of pages of notes. I'm usually doing this stage late at night when I can't sleep. I'm taking notes in a notebook. Here's one that I just finished this one a couple days ago. This I think is my 3rd notebook in this story. This is my science fiction young adult story that I'm working on right now. I'm using highlighters and just writing things down. And I do index my notebooks so that they're somewhat organized, but it's basically brain barf is what the first stage is. What I'm doing is going through some of the early questions in John Truby's Anatomy of Story. So what is the premise? Who is the most interesting character? What is the general designing principle of the story? What are the psychological and moral weaknesses and needs and self-revelations of the characters? That's all pretty important stuff in order to just kind of discover the story. I will often be writing scenes. Sometimes there will be details, sometimes it'll be more dialogue. Basically, all of it gets thrown out and it'll just be really messy all over the place. Doesn't look like a draft at all, it just looks like a page of notes. And then I'll move on to the next stage, and sometimes I'll have to move back into that previous 0 draft stage, depending on what I discover. I'm basically writing as far as my imagination will take me, and what I'm doing is discovering the ideas of my work. So draft 1, which is after the 0 draft stage, is all about the flow of information. What characters know what at different points of the plot, how they interact with each other, what do they think about each other, how do different characters feel at different times. This gives me a feel for how long the work might be and what sort of big picture changes I might still need to make. The second stage is organizing the brain barf into bullet points. I have, at this point in the drafting process, discovered things that made me go back and do all of my prep work over again. And that was okay because the product ended up being better. That happened in this current novel that I'm working on. During my last NaNoWriMo, I had already had a draft of this story that I wrote by hand just over a couple months, just writing a little bit every day. And then last NaNoWriMo, I was writing and everything changed because I suddenly discovered what the story was really about. There's usually a lot of outlining and prep work still going on in draft 1, but it definitely looks more like an outline than the last stage, which is just notebooks. Often in my outline stage, I will have dialogue spines, but they won't have description around them because it's pointless. There's no point in blocking things out because I know that most of that is not going to stay. It's going to change. There's no reason to make it all pretty and nice like a scene if I know it's going to change so drastically. If I start trying to imagine things too much in the earlier stages, what things are going to look like, usually because my plot is so shifty still in those early stages, it ends up being a waste of time, any research that I do in those stages about what things might look like. I do some research, obviously, for world building. If you're writing a science fiction story, you have to do some world building research in the early stages because you have to know, in general, what will happen. If your planet suddenly slows down its orbit in the middle of your story, you have to know how that will affect the plot because it'll probably be pretty big. Next stage is draft 2, and at this point I start getting into settings and imagery. I start really imagining the story at this point because I have enough information to where I know it's not going to be a total waste of time. I try and save as much of that as possible for this second draft stage where I'm imagining events actually happening and characters and what they're going to look like and how that matters thematically and stuff like that. That's when all that stuff starts coming together, is draft 2. This is where we begin to see scenes instead of just dialogue spines. In draft 3, I start getting the meat on the bones of my flow of information. This is where my science fiction story is right now, and it's very exciting, and I'm planning on working on that this November. because it worked so well for me last November. Just jumping into the story, I got about 22,000 words into it before I realized that I needed to totally change things and redo all of my prep work. I'm really looking forward to this nano when maybe I'll finish my draft and put some meat on the bones. After I finish this draft 2 stage 3 thing, when I finally have a story on my hands, I usually take a break because I usually need to just let it sit and just figure out how I feel about it and what things might need to change and just see where people are going to get hung up. And then we get to draft 3, which is stage 4, and my very favorite part of the writing process, because most of this is revision, and I love revision. I love putting things together and cleaning it up, and because it starts looking better, I can really start making it sound cool. By this point, I've done most of the research and the writing is flowing and the characters all know each other and they have relationships with each other, so it really starts kind of becoming a story. This is where I focus on making things really engaging and interesting, and I decide this needs to stay, this needs to go. I either take it out or heavily revise it if it's not interesting and engaging enough. And to be honest, I end up throwing out most of draft 2 because there's certain information that I have discovered as I went through draft 2 that I need to apply to the beginning, or there's certain information that I discover as I work on draft 3 that changes things, particularly character temperaments and relationships with each other and how they're feeling at different points and what interests them and what themes are going to be really interesting to the reader and to me. That's when it's draft 3 when I discover those things. So things get heavily revised, but I often will keep sections of scenes, or if there's a real zinger line, then I'll try and fit it in there somewhere. After draft 3, I'll often take a long break just to give myself a fresh set of eyes, and I'll work on a short story or something like that, just to kind of palate cleanse. And I'll come back to draft 4 and I'll kind of see the things that I might have been like too close to see before. This is the stage where I would really love to have a critique partner so that I could send pieces or whole chunks or maybe even the whole story to a critique partner so that they can give me their thoughts on the plot as a whole or the characters or whatever and help me figure out what needs change. There's often some waiting time in between these stages where I run into something and I'm not sure how to solve it, and so I'm just kind of put the story on the back burner and I'm working on something else. So draft 4, stage 5, is the tying things together draft, where I'm usually kind of stitching together scenes that aren't quite right or smoothing over weird transitions. This will be like the last draft where I'm making big revisions. I start editing things on like a line editing basis after this point. It's all about balancing things out. If a character's emotional line is kind of out of whack, I might kind of adjust that. And then there's draft 5, stage 6, which is editing for clarity. Draft 4 is really about smoothing. Draft 5 is really about fixing anything that has been really small that I've just been sort of overlooking for now because I was focused on bigger things. I'm really digging into typos and grammar things and like last minute little research details. Hey babe! And anything that I've left undone, I do now. And by the time I'm finished with this stage, it should be ready for sending to agents or magazines or whatever. I've sent a couple short stories out and like articles and one memoir essay. So I've actually brought 2 novels to draft 5, stage 6. But I did not send either of them out to editors or agents. I sent my first novel to an editor, and it just kind of was a negative experience for me. It's not that I'm underconfident, I just don't think that my stories were ready. I'm hoping maybe the one that I'm working on right now will be the one that I'm really confident in and that I'm like, yeah, this one is ready to go. So that's it for my drafts and stages of writing. I'd be interested to hear your drafts and stages if you have any outlined for yourself, if you like to write. Thanks for listening, guys. I really appreciate you watching and talking with me in the comments. It's just so fun to hear from you guys. Let me know if you're planning on doing NaNoWriMo. I'd love to hear about your projects, and there'll be more videos about NaNoWriMo, I'm sure. coming up because it's just such a fun time. Please like and comment and subscribe if you enjoyed this and you want to hear more videos, and there's like a little bell icon thing that you can hit if you want to get all of my notifications whenever I post a video. So I hope to hear from you guys soon. Bye!